Take off my clothes if you can. The giant bride dared the lone cowboy, he did, and started shaking the town of Dusty Creek was small, quiet, and hot. Its streets were wide but mostly empty, and the sun always seemed to shine a little too brightly, reflecting off the wooden buildings and the dirt roads. People moved slowly here, used to the heat and the quiet. Nothing exciting usually happened in Dusty Creek. Life was simple, maybe even boring to outsiders. But the day she arrived, everything changed. She was taller than most women in the town, though not impossibly so. What made her stand out wasn't her height, but her presence. She had a kind of confidence that filled a room the moment she entered. The townspeople whispered about her. Some said she looked like she had stepped out of a storybook. Others said she looked like someone who had lived through storms and fire and came out stronger on the other side. Everyone agreed on one thing. She was unlike anyone they had ever seen before. Her wedding dress, simple but elegant, clung to her in a way that showed she carried herself with pride. It was white, clean, and bright, a sharp contrast to the dusty town and the muted colors of the saloon and general store. The dress wasn't fancy or flashy, but it had a quiet strength, just like the woman herself. She didn't smile much, not at first, but when she did, it was enough to make people stop what they were doing and look. The lone cowboy noticed her first. He was leaning against the wooden railing outside the general store, hat tilted down over his eyes. He was a man of few words, known for keeping to himself and riding alone. People didn't really know his story, and he didn't tell it. But something about her caught his attention instantly. It wasn't just her height or the dress. It was the way she moved, like she owned every step she took without needing anyone's permission. He watched quietly as she walked down the street, boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The townspeople followed her with their eyes, but said nothing. Some nodded politely, others whispered behind their hands. The cowboy didn't say a word, but inside he felt a strange pull. He had never met anyone like her before, and even though he wouldn't admit it out loud, he was curious, more curious than he had been in a long time. As she passed the saloon, the bell above the door jingled. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a kind face, glanced at her and then back at the cowboy. He shrugged. There was a shared understanding in that shrug. Something was happening, something unusual, and they both knew it. The woman didn't go inside. She kept walking slowly, deliberately, as if she had a purpose but wasn't in a rush to reach it. The cowboy decided to follow her at a distance. Not too close, just enough to see where she was going. Dusty Creek didn't have many places to go, so he assumed it would be easy to keep her in sight. He stayed behind crates and posts, careful not to make a sound. The woman noticed him, of course. She didn't turn her head or speed up. She just kept moving, her eyes straight ahead, steady and unafraid. Pressing on. Finally, she stopped in front of an old wooden house at the edge of town. The paint was faded, and the wood looked like it had seen many years of wind and sun. The porch sagged slightly, but it still looked strong enough to hold someone standing on it. She climbed the steps slowly, resting her hands lightly on the railing as she reached the top. The cowboy stopped behind a tree, watching her every move. When she reached the top of the porch, she turned and looked straight at him. The cowboy froze. Her eyes were sharp, but they weren't angry. They were steady, almost as if she had been expecting him all along. For a moment, it felt like she could see everything inside him, the part he usually hid from the world. He felt a shiver run down his spine. Not from fear of her, but from something deeper. He didn't understand it yet, but he knew this woman was different from anyone he had ever met. "The pass, you're following me," she said softly, not accusingly, just stating a fact. Her voice carried over the dusty street and reached him clearly. He nodded slowly, tipping his hat but saying nothing. That was all the response she needed. She stepped closer to the railing, and he could see more clearly now. Her hair was dark, slightly wavy, and caught the sunlight in a way that made it shine like a river of bronze. Her face was strong, with high cheekbones and a jaw that didn't bend to anyone else's rules. She had scars, small ones, on her hands and arms. Signs of hard work, perhaps, or past struggles. She didn't hide them. They were part of who she was, and she carried them proudly. The cowboy swallowed hard. He wasn't used to seeing people who didn't hide their strength behind words or weapons. Most people in Dusty Creek were careful, polite, cautious, but not her. Confident without being reckless, confident without being arrogant. There was a calm power about her, and he realized that in the quiet town she would be impossible to ignore. For a few moments, they just stood there, looking at each other. The town seemed to fade away. The dusty street, the sun, the saloon, even the whispers of the townspeople, all of it disappeared. It was just the two of them, and something unspoken passing between them. Finally, she spoke again. "I'm here for a reason," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a weight to it, like she had carried it for a long time. "And I need someone who can understand." She didn't explain more. She didn't have to. The cowboy knew she was talking to him. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night he stayed near the porch, watching. The sun set behind the hills, turning the sky into colors he hadn't noticed in years. Gold, orange, soft purple. The town was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel empty. Something had changed. Something had arrived, and he knew that whatever this woman's story was, it was about to unfold right here, in Dusty Creek, and it would involve him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. By the time the stars appeared in the sky, the cowboy had made a silent decision. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know what challenges were coming, but he knew one thing. This woman, the giant bride, was someone he couldn't walk away from. Not this time. As he turned to leave, he paused for a moment, looking back at her. Pace. She was standing on the porch, tall and strong, looking at him with that calm, steady gaze. Something about her made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. And though he didn't know what tomorrow would bring, he knew he had to find out. And so the night in Dusty Creek ended with the quiet hum of possibility. The town slept under the stars, but the cowboy stayed awake, thinking of her, thinking of what was to come. Something big was starting, and neither of them would ever be the same again. The next morning, Dusty Creek woke slowly, the sun climbing over the hills and turning the town's streets golden. The heat had softened slightly, and a gentle breeze blew through, carrying the scent of dust and sage. Life in the town went on, as it always did, but for the cowboy nothing felt ordinary anymore. He had watched the giant bride the night before, and her presence lingered in his mind like a shadow that refused to leave. He mounted his horse and rode slowly toward the edge of town, trying to understand the pull he felt toward her. The dusty road seemed longer than usual, and every step of his horse reminded him of the quiet emptiness he had lived in for years. He had spent most of his life alone, carrying burdens that no one else could see. People in Dusty Creek respected him, but they didn't know him. And he had no intention of letting them. But the giant bride was different. She was like a storm that had quietly arrived and changed the air around him. He didn't know her story, but he felt that it was tied to his own in some invisible way. It wasn't just curiosity that drove him. It was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The feeling that someone might finally understand him, and maybe even accept him for who he was. As he rode, he saw her standing near the old wooden house again. The porch was empty this time, but she was there, arranging flowers in a small, worn vase. He stopped at a distance, watching quietly. The sunlight caught her hair, making it shine like bronze, and her hands moved gently, carefully, with a quiet grace that was almost hypnotic. She didn't notice him at first, and that allowed him to study her without her knowing. The cowboy dismounted and tied his horse to a nearby post. He took a few steps closer, keeping to the shadows of the trees, careful not to startle her. When she finally noticed him, she didn't seem surprised. Instead, she smiled faintly, a small curve of her lips that was both inviting and challenging. "You came back," she said, her voice calm, steady. There was no accusation in her tone, only observation. She tilted her head slightly, waiting for him to respond. The cowboy tipped his hat, a small gesture, and nodded. Words felt unnecessary. She understood that, and in the silence between them, something unspoken passed. For the next few minutes they just stood there, looking at each other. The town around them seemed to disappear. The wind whispered through the trees, and the distant sounds of people starting their day faded into nothing. It was as if the world had shrunk to just the two of them, and in that quiet they began to sense the weight of the stories they both carried. Finally, the giant bride spoke again. "I didn't come here to be seen," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I came here to be understood." The cowboy felt a shiver run through him. It was rare for anyone to speak so openly about their pain and their need. Most people hid behind polite words or smiles. But not her. She was honest, even when it was uncomfortable, and that honesty demanded attention. The cowboy nodded slowly, understanding more than she realized. "I know," he said quietly. "I've spent most of my life alone, too." He didn't explain further. Words had always been difficult for him, and he trusted her to understand without them. She didn't look away or judge. Instead, she seemed to consider his words carefully, weighing them in her mind. For the next hour, they walked together through the quiet streets of Dusty Creek. She told him about the journey that had brought her here, about the towns she had passed through, and the challenges she had faced. Her voice was steady, but it carried emotion beneath the surface. She didn't speak of sadness or anger directly, but in her words, the cowboy could sense the depth of her experiences. Now, she spoke of promises that had been broken, of dreams that had been left behind, and of the strength it took to keep moving forward even when life seemed unfair. The cowboy listened quietly, realizing that her story was not so different from his own. He had faced loss, isolation, and fear, but he had survived, just as she had. And in that shared understanding, a connection began to form, fragile but undeniable. As they reached the edge of town, they stopped near a small creek that ran through the valley. The water was clear and cool, reflecting the sunlight like a mirror. She knelt down and dipped her hands into the water, letting it trickle through her fingers. The cowboy stood a few steps back, watching. There was something almost sacred in the way she moved, a quiet reverence for life that he had never seen before. "You see the world differently," he said finally, breaking the silence. "You notice things most people don't." She smiled faintly. "I have to," she replied. "I have learned that life is made up of small moments. If you miss them, you lose a part of yourself." The cowboy thought about that. He had spent so many years rushing through life focused on survival that he had forgotten to notice the small moments. Watching her, he realized how much he had missed. The sun climbed higher, and the heat of the day began to settle over the valley. They sat by the creek for a while, talking quietly about things that mattered, not about trivial town gossip, not about the past they could not change, but about what it meant to live, to face fears, and to find strength in unexpected places. The giant bride's voice softened as she spoke of hope. "Even when life is hard," she said, "you can find something to hold on to, something that reminds you why you keep going." The cowboy nodded, frowned in despair. He had been holding on to fear for so long, and in her presence, he realized that maybe it was time to let it go. By the time they returned to the town, the cowboy felt a shift inside himself. Something had changed overnight. Something he couldn't quite name. The giant bride had not only entered Dusty Creek, but she had also entered his life, leaving an impression deeper than he expected. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would follow this story wherever it led. Back in the town, people noticed the two of them together. They whispered and stared, but neither the cowboy nor the giant bride paid attention. They were focused on each other, on understanding and being understood. The town had always been quiet, predictable, and safe, but now there was a spark of something new, a story unfolding, a life changing, and a connection forming that would not be ignored. As night fell over Dusty Creek, the cowboy sat on the porch of his small cabin, thinking about the day. He replayed the conversations, the laughter, the moments of silence, and the way she had looked at him. His heart felt lighter, though he didn't fully understand why. For the first time in years, he felt the possibility of something more, not just survival, but life itself. And in another part of town, the giant bride sat by the window of the old wooden house. She looked out at the darkening streets, her thoughts lingering on the cowboy who had quietly entered her life. She didn't know where this journey would lead either, but she felt a strange sense of hope. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely alone. That night, Dusty Creek seemed different. The stars shone brighter, the breeze felt softer, and even the distant sounds of animals and wind carried a sense of promise. It had begun, a story that would unfold slowly, carefully, but with power and depth. And at the heart of it, two people who had known loneliness and hardship were learning to trust, to connect, and to see the world, and each other, in a new light. The cowboy fell asleep that night with a strange peace in his heart. The giant bride's words echoed in his mind, a quiet reminder that courage wasn't just about facing danger, it was about opening yourself up, even when it scared you. And in that quiet, under the vast night sky, the first real chapter of their story together had begun. The next morning, Dusty Creek awoke to a pale sunlight spilling over the hills. The town had returned to its usual calm, but the cowboy felt different. His sleep had been restless, filled with dreams he didn't understand, dreams of wide-open spaces, of running and yet of standing still beside someone who could see him. He dressed quickly, saddled his horse, and rode toward the edge of town again, drawn by the same invisible thread that had pulled him to her the day before. The giant bride was already outside the old wooden house, tending to the small garden she had started the previous day. Though her dress was simple, it caught the light in a way that made her seem luminous. She moved with care, pulling weeds, arranging flowers, and pressing the soil gently around the roots. Her hands were strong, yet her movements were delicate. The cowboy dismounted a few yards away, letting the horse graze, and leaned against a fence post. He didn't want to interrupt her, but he couldn't help watching. She looked up at him and smiled, just slightly, the kind of smile that made him feel welcome without needing words. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, and carried a warmth that he hadn't realized he was missing. "I hope you slept well." "I did," he replied, tipping his hat. "And you?" She shrugged lightly. As well as I could. There was a pause before she continued. There's something I need to show you. Something from my past. Her eyes searched his, as if looking for permission, understanding, or perhaps courage. The cowboy nodded slowly, sensing the weight behind her words. He didn't need to ask questions. He knew she meant something important, something that would change the way he saw her, and perhaps himself. She led him behind the house where a small shed stood. Its paint was peeling and the wood looked like it had weathered many storms. Inside, the air smelled of earth, wood, and something faintly floral. Shelves lined the walls filled with objects of every kind. Old photographs, letters, trinkets, and small handcrafted items. Each object seemed to carry a memory, a story waiting to be told. The giant bride picked up a photograph, her fingers trembling slightly. In it, a young woman, much like herself, stood with a man, both smiling brightly. The cowboy looked closely. The man's face was unfamiliar, yet there was a warmth between them, a bond that was obvious even in the still image. "That's my fiancé," she said softly, her voice carrying both pride and sorrow. "We were supposed to be married here, in this town, but it didn't happen. Life had other plans." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she held the photograph with reverence, like a treasure she could never let go of, yet knew she must learn to release. The cowboy stayed silent. He had seen grief before, quiet grief, but this was different. It was not anger or regret that defined her story. It was strength, the kind of strength that only comes from surviving, from facing life's cruel twists and learning to move forward anyway. She put the photograph back carefully and led him to a chest in the corner of the shed. Opening it, she revealed a collection of letters tied with a ribbon. "These are from him," she explained. "We wrote to each other every day. Even when we were apart, we stayed connected, until the last letter. That one never got sent." She paused, her hand hovering over the envelope. "It was meant to explain why he left, why he couldn't stay. I never got the chance to read it." Not until now. The cowboy felt a lump in his throat. He understood loss. He knew what it felt like to have someone leave without explanation, to be left with questions that had no answers. He stepped closer, not wanting to intrude, but wanting to offer silent support. She finally opened the letter. Her eyes scanned the words quickly, and her lips moved as she read silently. When she finished, she looked at the cowboy. "Disdain. He loved me," she said simply. "But life had other plans." She closed the letter, folding it carefully and placing it back in the chest. "I've carried this with me for years. Every day, I wondered if I had done something wrong, if I could have changed things. And yet, I know now that none of it was my fault." The cowboy nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "life takes things from us that we can't control. We can only choose what we do with what's left." She looked at him, studying his face as if seeing the truth in his words. For the first time she seemed to relax slightly, as if sharing her past had lifted a weight from her shoulders. They spent the rest of the morning in the shed, going through photographs, letters, and small objects that told the story of her life before Dusty Creek. The cowboy learned about her childhood, the places she had lived, and the challenges she had faced. She spoke of small victories and quiet defeats, of people she had loved and lost, and of the moments that had shaped her into the woman he was beginning to admire. As the sun climbed higher, they stepped outside again. The air was warm, and the town was quiet. They walked slowly through the streets, talking about ordinary things, the market, the saloon, the river. But underneath every word there was a deeper connection forming. They were sharing not just stories, but understanding, empathy, and trust. The giant bride stopped near the edge of town, where a wide field stretched toward the horizon. The grass was tall and golden, swaying gently in the breeze. She turned to him, her eyes serious now. "I've shared my past with you," she said. "But there's more. There's something I haven't told anyone." "Something that I've carried alone for a long time. And I want you to know it, because I trust you. But it's not easy to say." The cowboy listened carefully. He had faced many hardships, but he had never encountered someone who carried their story so openly yet with such strength. He nodded slowly, encouraging her to continue. "I've always been strong," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "People see the outside, tall, confident, unafraid. But inside, inside, I've struggled. I've been scared, lonely, and uncertain. I faced things that would break most people. And yet, I kept going. I had to. Because if I stopped, there would be nothing left. I would lose myself. Breath." The cowboy's heart ached as he listened. He knew that feeling all too well. The fear of losing oneself, the loneliness, the constant fight to keep moving forward despite pain. He wanted to tell her that she wasn't alone anymore, but words felt too small. Instead, he reached out a hand, and she took it. It was a simple gesture, but it carried more meaning than any words could. They stood there, holding hands, letting the silence speak for them. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of earth and sunlight. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, and the cowboy felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He realized that sharing her story had not only freed her, but had opened a door for him as well. As the afternoon turned to evening, they returned to the town together. People watched them pass, whispering quietly among themselves. The cowboy and the giant bride ignored the attention. They had found something more important than gossip or curiosity, a connection, a trust, and the beginning of understanding. Back at the old wooden house, she prepared a simple meal, and they ate quietly. The conversation was light, filled with small jokes and observations, but underneath it, a deeper bond was forming. They were learning to see each other not just as strangers passing through a town, but as people with shared experiences, with pain, hope, and resilience. As night fell, the stars appeared in the sky, bright and clear. The cowboy and the giant bride sat on the porch looking up. The air was cool now, carrying the faint sounds of the town settling down. He felt a sense of wonder, not just at the beauty of the night, but at the journey that had brought them together. "I don't know what comes next," he said finally, breaking the quiet. "But I know I want to see it with you. I want to understand more, to be part of the story, if you'll let me." She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "I want that too," she said softly. "I've spent so long carrying everything alone. Maybe it's time to share it, to trust, to let someone in." For the first time, the cowboy felt hope, not the fragile kind he had carried before, but a steady, lasting hope. He realized that their meeting wasn't by chance. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that neither of them could have predicted. And as they sat together, holding hands and looking at the stars, they both knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would change their lives forever. The morning in Dusty Creek arrived slowly, with the sun spilling over the hills and casting long shadows across the town. The streets were quiet, almost peaceful, but there was a tension in the air that neither the townspeople nor the cowboy could explain. Even the birds seemed quieter, their songs soft, as if the world itself sensed that something significant was about to happen. The cowboy awoke in his small cabin with a sense of restlessness he hadn't felt in years. Sleep had been uneasy, filled with dreams that felt more like memories than imagination. He could still see her face clearly, the giant bride, standing tall and calm, yet carrying a weight he could sense but not fully understand. There was something about her presence that unsettled him in the most unusual way. Not frightening, but powerful and completely impossible to ignore. He dressed quickly and mounted his horse, the familiar leather saddle creaking under him. As he rode toward the edge of town, he noticed something unusual. Dusty Creek, normally quiet in the mornings, seemed strangely still. Where shuttered, and the few people he passed moved with a sense of purpose that suggested worry or anticipation. Something was different. Something was coming. At the edge of town, the giant bride was already waiting. She stood near the old wooden house, her posture straight, eyes scanning the horizon. The wind lifted her hair slightly, and she seemed even taller than usual, a figure of quiet strength against the rising sun. When she saw the cowboy approaching, she gave a small nod. No words were needed. They both sensed it. Whatever was coming would require courage, focus, and trust. "Something's not right," she said softly as he dismounted. Her voice carried a mix of concern and determination. "I've felt it since this morning. There's someone who's coming here, and they're not here to help." The cowboy frowned. "Who could it be?" he asked. His hand instinctively moved to the leather strap holding his saddlebag. In his life, he had faced many dangers. Wild animals, storms, and men who meant harm. But something in her tone made him pause. This wasn't ordinary trouble. I don't know, she admitted. "Psst. I've faced things before, and I've survived. But I can't do this alone." Her words were steady, yet there was an unspoken vulnerability beneath them. The cowboy nodded, feeling a surge of protectiveness. For the first time in a long time, he wanted to stand beside someone, not just for himself, but for her. They moved together through the town, alert to every sound. The streets were empty, the few townspeople inside their homes. Shadows stretched long across the wooden buildings, and the wind whispered through the alleyways. The cowboy and the giant bride communicated without words, a shared understanding guiding their steps. Every creak, every rustle, every distant sound became important. Suddenly a noise came from the general store, a door swinging open, a muffled shout. The cowboy signaled for her to stay back and crept closer. He saw a man rifling through supplies, his face shadowed but his intentions clear. He wasn't armed, not yet, but the tension in his movements suggested trouble. The cowboy stepped forward, keeping his voice low but firm. "Stop right there," he said. The man froze, eyes wide, realizing he had been caught. The cowboy didn't move closer immediately. Instead, he waited, giving the man a chance to leave peacefully. But the intruder didn't move. He looked at the cowboy, sizing him up, and then glanced toward the giant bride who had quietly moved beside him. "You're in the wrong town," the cowboy said, his voice steady. "Leave now and no one gets hurt." The man laughed nervously, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "This town's too quiet," he said. I thought maybe someone would try to stop me." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He had dealt with threats before, but this one felt different. The man wasn't just greedy or reckless. There was an edge to him, a sharpness that suggested cunning and determination. The cowboy exchanged a glance with the giant bride. She nodded slightly. He could see the resolve in her eyes, the same quiet strength that had drawn him to her from the beginning. With a swift motion, the cowboy stepped closer, his hands steady. "You don't want this fight," he said. "Turn around and leave." The man hesitated, weighing his options. He glanced at the door, then at the cowboy and finally at the giant bride. Something in her gaze, calm, fearless, unyielding, made him pause. He wasn't used to seeing someone unafraid, someone who could stand tall even when threatened. But then he made a sudden move, lunging toward the supplies, as if to grab something to use. The cowboy reacted instantly, blocking his path, moving with precision born of years of experience. The intruder stumbled back, and the giant bride stepped forward, her voice firm. "Enough," she said. "Leave now, or you'll regret it." For a moment, the man hesitated. He could see that the two of them worked together seamlessly, each anticipating the other's movements, each a reflection of courage and confidence. Finally, he turned and ran, disappearing into the hills beyond the town. The cowboy watched him go, then exhaled slowly, feeling the tension leave his body. The giant bride turned to him, her expression calm but serious. "You handled that well," she said. "But this isn't over. Whoever sent him, or whatever his reason, it's not done with Dusty Creek yet." The cowboy nodded, his mind racing. He had faced dangers before, but this felt different. It wasn't just a fight over money or supplies, it was personal, directed, and possibly connected to something he didn't yet understand. He realized that protecting her, and perhaps the town, would require more than courage. It would require trust, strategy, and patience. They spent the rest of the day preparing. The cowboy checked his supplies, ensuring everything was ready for any challenge. The giant bride moved through the town, speaking quietly to the few people she trusted, gathering information and making sure everyone was safe. There was a rhythm to their actions, a silent coordination that came from instinct and understanding. They were no longer two individuals. They were a team. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, the cowboy and the giant bride stood on the porch of the old wooden house, looking out over Dusty Creek. The air was warm, and the sky was painted with shades of orange and pink. Despite the beauty, a sense of anticipation lingered. They both knew that the danger was not gone. It was only waiting, watching, and perhaps planning its next move. "I've faced many challenges," the giant bride said softly, "but this one feels different. I can't explain why, but I feel like it's connected to more than just this town. Something bigger is coming." The cowboy listened, feeling the truth in her words. He had learned long ago that life often presented unexpected challenges, but the way she spoke suggested a depth of understanding he had never encountered before. "Whatever comes," he said, "we face it together." Her eyes met his, and for the first time there was a hint of relief in her expression. "Together," she agreed. Night fell over Dusty Creek, and the town grew quiet once more. The stars shone brightly, and the wind whispered softly through the streets. Inside the old wooden house, the cowboy and the giant bride prepared for the night, but sleep came slowly. Both were aware that this was only the beginning. The day's events had shown them a glimpse of the challenges ahead, and they knew that courage alone would not be enough. As the night deepened, they sat together on the porch again, talking quietly. The conversation was gentle, filled with reflections on the day's events and the lessons they had learned. They laughed at small moments, shared fears in whispers, and strengthened the bond that had grown between them over the past days. By the time the first light of dawn appeared over the hills, both of them felt a renewed sense of purpose. The cowboy understood that protecting her and the town meant more than facing immediate danger. It meant being present, alert, and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The giant bride knew that she could rely on someone who understood her, who shared her strength and her resolve. And so, as the sun rose, Dusty Creek seemed brighter, more alive. Even as the shadow of uncertainty lingered, the cowboy and the giant bride stood together, ready to face the coming challenges, knowing that whatever happened, they would not face it alone. The morning sun rose slowly over Dusty Creek, casting golden light across the town. The air was cool, carrying the scent of earth and distant wildflowers. The cowboy woke early, as he always did, but this time he felt a quiet sense of purpose rather than restlessness. He had learned in the past few days that life often demanded courage, but it also offered clarity when you faced it head-on. He saddled his horse and walked quietly toward the edge of town. The giant bride was already outside the old wooden house, standing tall on the porch. The sunlight made her hair glint like bronze, and her dress, simple yet elegant, reflected the calm strength she carried in every step. She looked at him as he approached, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink around them, just the two of them, facing the day together.
"Are you ready?" she asked softly, her voice steady.
The cowboy nodded. "I've never felt more ready for anything," he replied. His hand brushed against the leather of the saddle, a reminder that he had been trained for challenges. But nothing had prepared him for this, for the feeling that the journey they had shared was about to reach its turning point. They moved through the town together, their steps synchronized, each aware of the other. Dusty Creek was quiet, but the air carried tension, as if the town itself held its breath. The events of the previous day had shown them that danger could appear suddenly, without warning, and they were determined to face it with focus and courage. As they reached the outskirts, they saw a figure in the distance, the man from yesterday, the one who had tried to cause trouble. He stood still, watching, his posture cautious but defiant. The cowboy felt a surge of determination. He had faced threats before, but this one was different. It wasn't just about him or the town. It was about protecting the giant bride, and more importantly, about standing for what was right. The giant bride placed a hand lightly on his arm. "Remember," she said, "we face this together. Not just strength, but trust. That's what will carry us through." The cowboy nodded, feeling the truth of her words. They approached the man slowly, each step measured, each breath steady. The man saw them coming and took a step back, realizing that their confidence was not empty. Race. Together they were stronger than he could have anticipated. "Leave now," the cowboy said, his voice calm but firm. "There's no reason for this to continue. Walk away, and no one will be harmed." "Ah." The man hesitated, then sneered. "I'm not leaving. Not until I get what I came for." The giant bride stepped forward, her eyes unwavering. "There's nothing here for you," she said. "Not in Dusty Creek. Not in us. Nothing. Inspiration." Her voice carried authority, yet there was no anger. Only quiet, unshakable confidence. The man's defiance faltered slightly, but he refused to turn away. The cowboy took a step forward, placing himself between the man and the giant bride. "You've made your choice," he said. "Now you face the consequences." For a tense moment, the wind was the only sound. The man looked from one to the other, then finally made a decision. He turned and ran toward the hills, disappearing. into the distance. The cowboy and the giant bride watched him go, their breathing steadying, the tension finally leaving their bodies. The danger had passed, at least for now. But more importantly, the experience had shown them something crucial. They could rely on each other, not just in words, but in action. They had faced a challenge together and had come through stronger, more connected, and more certain of their bond. They walked back toward the town, the sun higher in the sky now, casting light on the streets and buildings. Dusty Creek seemed to breathe again, alive with the simple rhythms of daily life. People peeked out of windows, nodding and smiling at the sight of the two standing together, united and calm. As they returned to the old wooden house, the cowboy and the giant bride sat on the porch, watching the town. The silence between them was comfortable, filled not with uncertainty, but with understanding. "You were amazing today," the cowboy said, his voice quiet but sincere. "So were you," she replied. "I've faced many things alone, but with you, I felt safer. Not just physically, but in my heart. I felt understood." He looked at her, noticing the small details he hadn't before. The curve of her smile, the light in her eyes, the way her presence seemed to make the world more real. "I've never met anyone like you," he said. "You carry so much, and yet you make it look effortless." She laughed softly, a sound like music in the quiet town. "It hasn't been effortless," she admitted. "I've carried fear, loneliness, and pain for years, but I've learned that sharing it doesn't make you weak. It makes you stronger. And now, I feel stronger because you're here." The cowboy felt a warmth in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Breaths he had spent so long running from his own fears, keeping his heart closed, and avoiding connection. But in the presence of the giant bride he realized that courage wasn't just about facing the world alone. It was about trusting someone enough to face it together. They spent the afternoon exploring the town, speaking to the townspeople, and helping where they could. The community, once cautious and wary, began to open up, drawn to the quiet strength and confidence of the pair. Children ran past them laughing, shopkeepers waved, and even the animals seemed to sense the peace that had returned to Dusty Creek. As evening approached, the cowboy and the giant bride returned to the porch, sitting side by side in companionable silence. The sky was painted with colors that seemed impossible, deep purples, soft pinks, and bright golds. The wind carried the scents of the fields and distant hills, and for the first time, they both felt a sense of completion, of resolution. "I never thought I'd find someone who could understand me," the cowboy said quietly. "You found me," she replied softly. "And I've found you. We don't have to face the world alone anymore." He reached for her hand, and she took it, their fingers intertwining naturally. The gesture was simple, but it carried more meaning than words could ever express. It symbolized trust, respect, and the bond that had grown between them through shared stories, challenges, and quiet moments of understanding. The town of Dusty Creek slept peacefully that night, unaware of the full extent of the challenges that had been faced and the strength it had taken to overcome them. But for the cowboy and the giant bride, the night was filled with a quiet sense of hope, a feeling that whatever came next, they could face it together. They talked quietly on the porch, sharing stories of their past, dreams for the future, and hopes that had long been buried. Each word, each glance, each smile deepened the connection between them, showing that even after fear, loss, and loneliness, trust and understanding could flourish. Round, as the stars sparkled above, the cowboy realized something he had long forgotten. Life could be filled with beauty, not just struggle. He had spent years facing the world alone, carrying burdens that had never been shared. But now, with the giant bride beside him. He understood that true strength came not from isolation, but from connection. The giant bride looked at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight, and smiled. "We've faced challenges together," she said, "and we've come through stronger. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together too." He nodded, feeling a profound sense of peace. "Together," he agreed. The night grew deeper, but neither of them moved inside. They stayed on the porch, letting the quiet of Dusty Creek and the vastness of the night sky settle around them. There was a sense of closure, of endings, and yet a sense of new beginnings. They had faced the unexpected, learned to trust, and discovered that courage and connection were more powerful than fear. When they finally stood to go inside, the cowboy and the giant bride knew that life in Dusty Creek would never be the same, for them or the town. But they were ready to face each day with confidence, ready to share their strength, ready to live fully. And for the first time in a long time, they felt free. As the moon rose high above the hills, casting its silver light over Dusty Creek, two figures stood side by side on the porch, watching the world in quiet harmony. The cowboy and the giant bride had faced challenges, shared stories, and built trust. And in that trust, they had found not just courage, but hope, connection, and the promise of life's possibilities. For them, the journey was far from over, but they had learned the most important lesson of all, that facing the world together with honesty, courage, and trust could turn even the hardest days into moments of strength and joy. And with that knowledge, they were ready to face whatever came next, together.